Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to Addis dialogue with me, Shifarao. Now, many agree that Africa has been a victim of negative narratives driven by different media outlets, especially those in the West. Today on the show, we'll be exploring the extent to which Africa has been victimized by the erroneous narratives and stereotypes in a seemingly apparent move to tarnish the image of this great continent, Africa. And we will also touch upon some of the efforts being exerted by different media outlets in Africa in order to tackle these issues. In order to break it down for us, George Nyabuga is joining me. Is Associate Dean at the Aga Khan University's Graduate School of Media and Communications, and of course, Associate Professor of Media Journalism. I'm your host, Shifarao. Do stay with us. Well, Professor, many thanks for making the time to talk to us.
Thank you. And I'm delighted to be part of these conversations. Yes, as we said, a conversation by Africans for Africa.
Exactly. So we're going to have a lot to unpack because this is a persistent issue for many years because of disinformation, misinformation, and things like that. So one of the issues this continent faces is the way that it is portrayed by different media outlets, especially those in the West, as you know. So what are some of the major motives behind this, Prof? And how is Africa being portrayed by some external media outlets?
Well, I think the Western media, of course, have an agenda to drive, as we know. So whenever it is that you look at such media organizations as CNN, for example, BBC or Al Jazeera and others, there's a narrative that Africa is, of course, fraught with poverty, with conflict, with numerous challenges that African leadership is unable to resolve. One of the things, for example, that we're currently seeing is the conflict in eastern parts of DRC. And whenever we see that kind of conflict, that sort of illustrates and confirms some of the ideas and agendas that the Western media wants to drive. And of course, the inability of the African leadership and African peoples to resolve such conflicts then gives the Western media the material and the content that they need to support some of the arguments that they want to advance through certain narratives and certain discourses that they want to, advance. Partly because of international relations that, want to paint Africa as a failed continent, as a dark continent, as a continent that is unable to resolve its own challenges. And I suppose the media oftentimes privileges negative stories. As we know, negative stories are more interesting and they sell a lot more compared to positive stories. And that is what the Western media tends to focus on. I suppose if they focused on positive stories, then people with the kind of choices that they have are going to switch on switch off and switch on to something else that would be more newsworthy. And I suppose for us to try and change that narrative, we have to perhaps develop as Africans a more positive narrative, a narrative that is driven by Africans themselves, so that what is positive comes out prominently as compared to the negative narratives.
Many generally agree that Africa is frequently, as you say, depicted through a narrow lens, if you will, that emphasizes negative aspects of Africa, such as poverty, conflicts, diseases, political instability, and things like that. And such portrayals, unfortunately, can reinforce stereotypes, overshadowing the continent's diversity, culture, and growth, and the positive aspect of the continent of Africa. So in this regard, what are some of the major agenda, if you will, that these media outlets are pushing against Africa?
As you said, Africa is very diverse. I mean, we have countries from West Africa that have different cultures to East Africa that are obviously very different to Southern and Northern African countries. And that kind of diversity is very important if we want to advance an African narrative that we've got a lot going on. We've got a lot of differences, but a lot of common good things. But I suppose, as we said, whenever it is that we look at Africa from the north to the south, from the west to the east, there's always something negative going on. So there's, for example, conflict in parts of West Africa. There's conflict, as we said, in parts of Eastern Africa. There is, disease in many parts of Africa. And that's what many media, even national media, even African media, tend to focus on the negative, mainly because the agenda is driven by commercial media that privileges ratings. And these ratings would be in terms of viewership, listenership, or circulation of newspapers or web clicks, if you may. And a majority of us go to different platforms to get news that that interest us. As I said earlier, oftentimes many of us tend to be interested with negativity. So if it's suffering, I think that's what we want to know about. If it's conflict, if it's disease, if it's poverty, I suppose that is what many of us would be interested in. And that is something that has interested Western media, but also African media for a long time. So unless, for instance, we change the funding model or business model of the various media houses to show that we don't have to obsess with the negative for the content to sell, then that is going to be the way Africa will continue to be portrayed. And this is, of course, terrible for Africa and Africans that know that there's a lot going on in the continent. And it's up to us to change that narrative in one way or the other. Maybe we make baby steps, maybe through these kind of conversations. But that may take time. But I think it's important for us to be resilient if we want to be able to portray Africa in a positive light and stop obsessing about the negative and stop portraying Africa as a failed continent or as a continent that is in need of Western interventions in one way or the other. And I suppose, as I said, the Western media itself wants to drive a certain ideology, especially in the international arena, where of course they're competing for viewership, they're competing for these ratings. And if you're competing for those ratings, then I think you want to provide news or content that sells. And unfortunately, negativity tends to sell a lot more than the positive aspects of issues. But I don't think that is peculiar to Africa. When you look at stories on Western media from Asia, of course, there would be perhaps business stories. There would be development stories that may be positive. But there's a lot more negative content compared to positive content. But that doesn't have to be the case, of course.
Yeah, Professor, despite some of the great achievements African media outlets made, they sometimes, as you said, succumb to, if you will, negative portrayals due to lack of resources or the influence of external media narratives. So the portrayal of Africa in both types of media, external or internal media outlets, can influence perceptions, obviously shaping how Africans can view themselves and how the world also perceives the content. So can we specifically say, Prof, African media outlets themselves have been victims of propaganda driven against the continent in some way so far?
When you look at national media in various countries, of course, maybe they're doing very well, based on the fact that there's I think a little push from governments, from leadership, but also from the people that work in those media houses. the journalists themselves, the editors, to try and balance between the negative and the positive. So, the negative news might be more prominent. Oftentimes, there might be a bit of positive news, but what we see prominently is negative news. And in terms of prominence, and that's what we tend to remember. So if you look at the front pages, if you look at the first articles on TV, it might be, about conflict, for example, in DRC today, or the killings in different parts of Africa. But cumulatively, or when you look at it in totality, and perhaps do a very serious content analysis of the media houses in terms of the news bulletins, for example, or the programs or the newspaper articles, there might be a bit of positive stories. But broadly, of course, media houses in Africa cannot, for example, prevent themselves from succumbing to these negative influences that you mentioned. Because it's a global environment, a global media environment that is in one way or the other influenced by, what is going on in different parts of the world. So whenever it is that you look at African TV media environment, for instance, you see the influence of CNN, the influence of BBC or Al Jazeera or, Deutsche Welle. On the news presentations in parts of Africa. So the news bulletins seem to borrow from what is going on in different parts of the world. And that means that that Western influence on local production and distribution of, for example, content on news is, already there. Of course, it's very difficult to resist what is going on in the broader media landscape, given sometimes the challenges that we have with resources, including human resources, but also monetary resources that become important because monetary resources are important in terms of collecting, packaging, and distributing, for example, content. And without those resources, then it becomes very difficult to resist the urge to publish what you think will sell, because the editors in commercial media, for instance, will tell you that they suffer the pressure of publishing what they think will sell the papers. The people on television will tell you that they'll publish stories that will attract and retain audiences. And this is something that we see in a hugely competitive media environment. And for that reason, I think those pressures are there, and they succumb to the modern trends of media production and distributions, but also the business models that we talked about that seem to be failing in the context of economic downturn in many African countries, but also maybe the effects of COVID-19, but also the international relations where Western countries seem to be hugely nationalistic, and consequently, the trade imbalances affect our local economies. And once our local economies are affected, the support that ought to accrue to the media houses might not be there. And for that reason, they would lack the resources necessary to produce content that is positive, content that is more reflective of the realities, of the positive realities in Africa.
Yeah, that's a great insight, Professor. There are, of course, a number of factors, driving factors, that are still contributing to this negative image or negative narratives being driven against Africa. Of course, there are a lot of media outlets in Africa, be it regional or national, ranging from newspapers, television stations, online platforms, things like that. However, some question as to what extent these media outlets are vibrant enough and capable of dealing with these negative stereotypes driven against the continent. So to what extent are they capable of successfully dealing with the various issues and narratives being pushed against the continent of Africa, Professor?
As you mentioned, of course, nationally, for example, in Kenya, we have various newspapers. We have a lot of TV stations. We have a lot of radio stations. The same thing in Ethiopia, the same thing across many African countries. One of the major challenges, of course, is resources. As we mentioned earlier, the monetary resources that are necessary to collect information and to package content in such a way that it's interesting and is able to attract and retain audiences is perhaps what is lacking. Many media houses, especially at the national level, but also the international level, are suffering serious financial challenges. And as we know, financial challenges mean that the media houses are incapable of producing content or, that requires sometimes a lot of money. So, for instance, for TV stations to go out into the field, they need the resources, monetary resources, human resources, and the various other resources, but monetary resources particularly, because once you have money, then you're capable of attracting and retaining talent, you'll be able to employ the best producers, you'd be able to employ the best journalists, you'd be able to employ the best editors. But the inability to do that means then that you oftentimes rely on press releases, for instance, you rely on press conferences and such sources of material. But for journalism and for the media houses to really work, they must go into the field to the grassroots rather than being at the capital, for example, or in capital cities. And pretend to understand what the country looks like, for instance. So you can imagine if most of the media houses are based in Addis Ababa, for instance, and covering a huge country such as Ethiopia, you'd be unable to tell the stories from the grassroots. You'll be unable to tell the positive stories from the western or eastern parts of Ethiopia. The same applies in many African countries. When you look at Kenya, most of the media houses are based in the capital city, Nairobi. When you look at Uganda, most of the media houses are based in Kampala, and various other national, media landscape looks almost the same. And in that kind of environment where you do not have, for example, bureaus at the grassroots, and you have to rely on journalists either parachuting in and pretending to understand local issues, then that would be providing only a surface sort of coverage of issues that do not offer a deeper understanding of what local communities, for example, go through, or producing stories from different parts of the countries that we have. Earlier, we talked about diversity. Africa is very diverse in terms of languages, for example, in terms of cultures, in terms of and culture. For example, we can talk about food, we can talk about fashion, we can talk about local practices. And consequently, if we are unable to provide that kind of diverse content, then we are not doing service to most of the African issues that we see. And consequently, whatever it is that we see is rather on the surface than the kind of depth that we want to go into whenever it is that we looking at media performance and the ability to, of course, maybe investigate issues, bring out those issues to the limelight. And yes, majorly, let me say that it is because of, various challenges, and this would be financial challenges. Financial challenges then that would have a domino effect on other issues, because as I said, if you don't have the resources, you are unable to hire the best people to produce for you. You are unable to get the best technologies for you to produce content. You are unable to build the kind of studio or get the kind of equipment that you would need to produce appealing content or content that is interesting to diverse publics or diverse audiences.
That's a great insight. So, of course, there are a number of challenges and a number of key factors, one of them being, as you said, economic. Despite its population, its large population, Africa faces several challenges. Of course, you touched upon some of them that hinder the establishment of a strong Pan-African media outlet. So this begs the question as to why such a great continent is still unable to establish a strong Pan-African media outlet. What are some of the reasons that you see in this regard?
Let me say that we used to have a Pan-African news agency. I think it was called PANA, Pan-African News Agency, that used to collect news from different parts of the continent, and of course, then distributed to people that subscribed to that, and those who are the media houses that subscribed to the news agency, and consequently, the material would be published in various countries via various platforms, including radio and television. But of course, over time, we see that many African countries were unable to contribute the financial resources that were necessary to keep PANA afloat. And for that reason, of course, it more or less collapsed. And consequently, I think what we see is the inability of African leaders to put together another outfit such as PANA because of different ideologies, because of different perhaps interests that the leadership has. But also, having an African media house or African outfit such as PANA does not mean that they will tell stories from across the African continent. As we said, many media houses tend to focus on our capital cities, and consequently, they would cover leadership, for example, political leadership in those countries where they're based in the urban areas. They would cover conflict, they would cover poverty, and they would cover, any other challenges that the continent might face. And for that reason, perhaps you need to develop, a very good strategy if you're going to have a Pan-African media platform or a news agency, just maybe to use that example, because you must have a clear idea of why it is that you want to set up one. Otherwise, it will go the same route as PANA. But majorly, let me say that it is because of the inability to mobilize resources to put such an outfit together, and the inability of African leaders to think that that kind of outfit is necessary if we have to retell the African stories, or if we have to develop content, the kind of content that we want to see out of Africa, and stop complaining that maybe Western media is portraying Africa negatively. Beyond that is the fact that we can utilize technologies, we can utilize social media, for instance, to tell positive stories. We know that social media, for instance, and technologies have democratized information production and distribution. So there's no reason why, for instance, African editors and stakeholders and opinion leaders can't come together and say that we need a different strategy for telling the African story, and consequently identify a platform that perhaps doesn't need as much resource. Because we know that, lots of young people with very little resource, monetary resource, but with a passion, producing content that is interesting to disparate audiences across the world. But nonetheless, if we want to start an African outfit, then African leaders must walk the talk and put the resources together, put the ideas together, and start to set up such a media platform.
Professor George Nyabuga, I really enjoyed your ideas, and thank you so much for your time. Of course, I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And I appreciate the time that we've spent together talking about this important issue. So
Yes,
thank
sir.
you. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. You're most
All right.
welcome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Many thanks to you as well for having been with us so far. Until I see you next time with yet another program, it's a goodbye from me, Shifa Raulak.